I welcome you all to the ISID Research Seminar Series. We have a presentation on reigniting the man-made clothing sector in India, co-authored by Abhishek Anand and Naveen Joseph Thomas. The textile sector and the apparel sector in India has been the fabric of Indian economy and continues to do so. However, it is also a sector which has seen and faced major changes in terms of technology, in terms of policies and the global economic structure. The factors behind the deterioration and the sustained lag performance of this sector in India has been analyzed by many studies. This particular study brings to the fore the reasons behind the loss of competitiveness in the man-made textile and clothing sector in India. We have invited Professor M. Vijay Bhaskar, Dr. Bindu Oberoi, and Dr. Sanjay Kumar Malik as discussants to this paper presentation. The protocol followed in ISID Research Seminar Series is that the presenters are given about 20 to 30 minutes to present their work, while the discussants have 10 to 12 minutes each to put forth their respective comments. This is followed by an open question and answer session from the other participants who join us for the seminar. I therefore request the presenters and the discussants to speak within the stipulated time provided to them in order for the wider audience also to join this discussion. So before inviting Naveen to make the presentation, I would like to introduce the authors of this paper as well as our respected discussants. Mr. Abhishek Anand has recently joined the global MTI team in Delhi as an economist. Prior to this, he worked as a consultant in the PricewaterhouseCoopers Middle East. And before that, he served as a career civil servant with the Government of India. Abhishek graduated from Harvard Kennedy School with a degree in Masters in Public Administration in International Development in 2021. He has also an MA and a BA in Economics from the Delhi University. Dr. Naveen Joseph Thomas is presently an associate professor at the O.P. Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. He has completed his PhD from Delhi School of Economics and received his MSc in Economics from the Terry School of Advanced Studies. His research interest lies in the areas of household economics, growth theory, labor economics, and issues of MSME sector. In the panelists, we have Professor M. Vijay Bhaskar, who is a PhD in economics and MPhil in applied economics from the Center of Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram. Presently, he is a professor at Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, and has been associated with the institute for last 20 years. He has also been a visiting professor and a visiting fellow at many institutes such as the Institute of Geography and Sustainability, University of Lausanne, IIT Madras, and IIIT Bangalore. His area of research lies in political economy of regional development, excuse me, agrarian and rural change, rural-urban interactions, industrialization, etc. We welcome you, sir, to the panel. Dr. Bindu Oberoi is an associate professor of economics at the Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. She did her MA and MPhil in economics from the Delhi School of Economics and completed her PhD from Center of Economic Studies and Planning, JNU. She has authored the book titled The Textile Industry in India, Changing Trends and Employment Challenges from Oxford University Press in 2017. She has also published articles on key domains of textile and clothing sector in India in a number of peer-reviewed international journals. We welcome you, ma'am. Dr. Sanjay Kumar Malik is an assistant professor in ISID. He has a doctoral degree in economics from Center for Development Studies, CDS, Thiruvananthapuram. His doctoral work examines the processes of generation of innovations in India's textile machinery industry. His research interest comprises innovation and technological change, FDI, and labor economics. We welcome you, Dr. Sanjay. Without further ado, I call upon Dr. Naveen to make the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Rama. Let me share my screen. Thank you, Dr. Rama, for giving Abhishek and I this opportunity to present our study, and also providing us an august panel of august panelists of reviewers and discussants to help improve our study. It's still in a working paper stage, but hopefully with the valuable suggestions and comments made by the discussants, we should be able to improve this paper. My only regret is that we weren't able to send a more updated manuscript to the reviewers, sorry, the discussants. And hopefully we'll be able to cover some of the more updated statistics while we go through this presentation. I also want to thank CDS Trivandrum and Ford Foundation for funding the study. And with that, let me very quickly begin with the proceedings. Right. So, as Dr. Rama was saying, we have a fairly long tradition in the textile and clothing sector, textile and apparel sector in India, particularly in the production of cotton cloth. And the quality of cotton cloth produced in India was fabled, with several historical references of the cloth being so fine, or the muslin cloth produced in India being so fine that it could be drawn through a finger ring. Now, for a most part, all up to the 19th century, India was a monopoly for raw as well as manufactured cotton. And what also set aside the sector prior to the 19th century in India was that it was fairly decentralized. Manufacture of cotton cloth was very decentralized. This is completely contrast to the way cotton cloth was manufactured in most of the developed, to the way in which cotton cloth was produced in the newly industrialized European countries. Now, having said that, the period after the 1800s mostly saw India receding from cotton cloth production and the manufacture of cotton cloth being completely disseminated all through till the mid 1800s under the East India Company. Now, what is also important to note is post the exit of the East India Company in the 1950s, favorable policies adopted by the British government helped the sector grow. And by the time India became independent, it was a leading textile producer. And this textile sector was a modern sector that emerged from the comparative advantages that it had in the availability of indigenous raw cotton, extremely cheap labor, access to British machinery, and a rich mercantile tradition, including the railway networks developed by the British. Now, post-independence, we haven't fared as well. The industry policy of independent India followed the socialist pattern of development, and it insulated the sector from international competition and investment. And the production techniques were heavily regulated, which led to a very steady recession of our textile sector from world markets. And this trend was only reversed with the textile policy of 1985, and strongly so after the reforms of 1991. Our textile policy has been primarily cotton biased, with a shift reflecting only in the new textile policy. Although it became textile neutral starting the textile policy of 1985, the shift towards the changed global scenario is only reflected in the most recent textile policy. Now, the cotton textile bias has put our clothing sector at a disadvantage in the global markets, which has been since the 1990s shifting predominantly to man-made fiber-based cloth. Going down the value chain, if you look at the apparel sector, the production was in the sector was reserved primarily for the small-scale enterprises up to 2001. Unless the non-small scale industries exported more than 50% of this output. This led to a peculiar small-scale bias in the apparel sector. But at the same time, it also provided a safe haven for some of the producers some of the medium and large producers that were already operating in the sector. So in a sense, we mostly had the sector of a large cluster of very, very small apparel producers and a few very large globally competitive producers. Now, despite the restrictive history and the policies that we've had post-independence, the sector continues to play a very, very important role in our economy, particularly for our manufacturing sector. Now, why does the sector require attention at this juncture? With the economy slowing down in recent years and unemployment soaring, there has been a renewed urgency to boost the manufacturing sector. In 2014, at the juncture of the change in our political regimes, our current Prime Minister targeted India's manufacturing sector to gain up to 25% of India's 25% share of India's GDP by 2023. Now that date has passed, and we're still at the level that we started off with at 2014 at roughly around 14 to 15%. Now, a lot more needs to be done there, particularly in the labor-intensive sectors. The high-skill manufacturing and services sector have fueled most of the phenomenal growth that we've seen in the last 2 decades. I mean, well, not even the last 2 decades, but all through the first decade of this millennia. But these sectors are now slowing down, and we cannot hope to be able to achieve the twin objectives of generating growth as well as jobs by just banking on these 2 sectors. So the textile sector, given our long traditions as well as some of our innate domestic advantages, becomes extremely important. If you look at employment in the sector, if you combine textile and the apparel sector, according to the 6th economic census, it accounted for almost 30% of total employment. And if you look at just the registered sector, it accounts for about 20% of overall employment generated in manufacturing, according to the most recent numbers from the Annual Survey of Industries. A backhand calculation suggests that about a 10% increase in textile and apparel exports is associated with about 4% increase in employment levels. So there's no doubt that given considering our employment scenario and job generation scenario, this sector and particularly its external competitiveness is very, very key. Now, what also sets apart this sector is that while the rest of manufacturing, well, most of manufacturing is seen to be less desirable for women as a workplace. And if we take all of women employment, women workers employed in the non-textile and non-clothing manufacturing sector, it's only about 14%. And the apparel and textile sector stands apart with an impressive 34% of their workforce being women. And this is particularly significant given that over the last decade, there's been this raging debate of the low and declining levels of female labor force participation. So from that perspective, for generating jobs which are acceptable for women's work becomes a very key issue, and the textile and apparel sector have a key role to play there. Now, another concern is that, well, over the last decade, with rising levels of wages in China, it has ceded space in the low-skill manufacturing sector, especially textile and apparel. But unfortunately, India hasn't been able to make any headway in terms of gaining international share in the international markets and gaining a share of this the ceded space by China. In fact, several developed countries are fared better than India. Now, this is still a fairly large concern. In fact, we've done our share in textile and apparel has shrunk over the last decade, which is again very concerning. Sorry. Now, if you look at the GVA of the sector, we're looking at the real GVA of this sector, both apparel and textile combined. These are all normalized numbers. We see that if you look at the period post the textile policy of 1985 and the reforms of 1991, that's this region, we see a significant growth in this sector. However, this growth has of late tapered off, which is a cause of concern. In terms of our, on the external front, while we grew quite a bit post 1985, all the way up to the first decade of this millennia, we haven't been doing too well in terms of textile and apparel exports over the last 1 decade. This data is from UN Comtrade. Although this decline seems less pronounced if we look at the WTO data, but the decline is still pretty evident. Okay. Now, the question is, why has the last decade been so fed? So why has the textile and apparel sector fared so poorly in this last decade? Now, there are several long-standing bottlenecks of the manufacturing sector, including high cost of doing business, poor management practices, unfavorable trade policies. Now, all of these are important in determining India's global competitiveness. But these are long-standing issues and does not explain why we've particularly done worse in the last 1 decade. Now, to try and sort of decompose and try and analyze the problem in the textile sector better, we go down the value chain of textile production, starting from fiber usage. Now, first, we try and understand how India has compared with the rest of the world in terms of the fibers used for making cloth. And what we observe is that the rest of the world has consistently been shifting to man-made fiber because of their superior qualities. But India has predominantly remained cotton biased. Right? By the early 1990s, most of the world fiber usage shifted to man-made fibers. And the most recent numbers indicate that the world markets use 70% of man-made fibers in cloth production and about 30% of natural fibers, which is predominantly cotton. But India is on the diametric opposite, and our share of usage of man-made fibers is exactly opposite of what we see in the world. It's roughly about 30% for cloth production. Now, if you look at overall textile fiber production in India, we see that over the last decade, production of cotton has been fairly robust, but there has been a tapering and decline and an overall stagnation in the man-made fiber production. And the Man-Made Fiber Subcommittee report of 2010 identified certain unique structural issues of the man-made fiber sector, which explains why the sector hasn't done well. Now, well, although this was in 2010, most of these problems have remained. And these problems include a high concentration of production, with the top 2 producers in each of these man-made fiber segments, that includes cellulosic as well as non-cellulosic type of fiber and yarn, accounting for over 60% of production. For example, if you just look at viscose and cellulosic fiber, it's a clear monopoly with only one producer producing almost all of viscose fiber in India. Now, what we did was we calculated the Hirschman-Herfindahl index for polyester staple fiber, and I'll explain why we focus on polyester in a minute. And we see that this sector was already concentrated with an HHI index of 0.23 in 2014, which rose to about 0.34 in 2019-20. where 0.25 is the threshold for a highly concentrated segment. Now, although, so we calculate these numbers using the annual survey of industries, and we know that this data is establishment level and not firm level. And in the data, it's very clear that some of these establishments or factories belong to the same firm. If we carefully look through the states of these plants. And it's clear that some of these establishments belong to the same same firm, but there's no way for us to track back establishments or factories to the owning firms. But if we were to do that, we'll see that the concentration indices are much, much higher than this. So this can be treated as, given the data restrictions, this can be thought of as a lower limit. It's actually much higher. Now, the other problem that the sector has faced is the high cost of debt servicing by man-made fiber producers compared to the rest of the world, but that's always been a problem. Doesn't particularly explain why man-made fiber production has stagnated in India. What we do is we focus on polyester fiber and filament yarn. And the reason why we do this is because globally, as well as for India, this is the dominant man-made fiber used in the textile and apparel sector. And if we track the production of man-made fibers in India, we see that most of this decline has been due to a decline in polyester fiber and yarn. On the other hand, we have cellulosic fibers and yarns, which have, on the other hand, over the same period, roughly increased in production. So given the dominant share of polyester-based fibers, the decline in polyester explains the decline in man-made fiber production in India. Now, what is the reason for this decline in production? Does this have something to do with global trends or trends in domestic consumption? If we look at global production of man-made fiber, we've seen a robust increase all through the last decade. And if you look at consumption of polyester fiber, here again, we see a consistent rise in the consumption of polyester fiber in India over the last decade. So clearly the stagnation that we observe has to do more than consumption or global trends. And a lot of this has to do, this decline in polyester production has to do with problems in some key fiber intermediaries. Now, let me very quickly take you through the process of production of polyester. Now, the key intermediary for production of polyester is purified terephthalic acid, which is a hydrocarbon derivative. It's derived from naphtha to paraxylene and is refined to pure terephthalic acid. And the other significant input for producing polyester is monoethylene glycol, or MEG. Now, PTA, or purified terephthalic acid, is comprised about 70 to 75% of the input required to produce polyester, whereas monoethylene glycol is about 23 to 25%. Now, for these key fiber intermediaries, the production of these fiber intermediaries in India has stagnated, particularly in the last decade. In fact, post-2014, it's grown negatively for the most part. And to top this, there has been a policy mix in terms of anti-dumping duties, as well as a tariff hike that was imposed on PTA over the last decade, which has adversely affected the sector. The anti-dumping duty was introduced in 2014 and lasted up to 2020. And we see that post-2020, there is a fairly sharp spike in the import of PTA, which is even sharper if we look at the most recent data from 21 to 22. The tariff hike was introduced in 2018, when the tariff on PTA as well as MEG was increased from 7.5% to 10%. Now, all of this made the key intermediates for producing polyester relatively expensive in India. And this has had effects further downstream in production of polyester, processing, as well as apparel. Now, going through some of the details of this policy-induced setback to the polyester manufacturing. Two of the largest PTA producers in India, Reliance Industries and Mitsubishi Chemicals Corporation, registered a case with the Director General of Trade Remedies in October 2013 for unfair trade practices by major PTA exporters. Now, this led to the government imposing an anti-dumping duty on PTA in the range of $24 to $117 a ton for imports from China, South Korea, Thailand, and the European Union. So initially, when these duties were imposed, these were supposed to be in effect for 6 months. However, this kept extending all the way up to July of 2020, when the government announced a rollback on them. What is also curious is, over the same time period, the tariff rate was hiked from 7.5 to 10% in 2018. And this anti-dumping duty combined with the tariff hike led to India's imports of PTA contracting by a significant 35% between 2014 and 2019. The decline in PTA production was followed by contraction in import, which led to a relative rise of PTA prices compared to competitors in India. I'll show you a graph which explains how India faced the setback. And faced with these rising input prices, the profit margins of the firms producing polyester declined quite drastically. And there was a fair amount of noise created by some of the key polyester producers like Indorama, Alok Industries, as well as Bombay Dyeing. In fact, they also argued to be given protection by filing a case for anti-dumping duties against import of polyester in 2017. Now, although this case was rejected, the anti-dumping duty didn't come into place. But at the same time, the tariff rate on polyester went from 10 to 20% in 2018, which essentially did the trick. So the unfair protection, and the reason why the protection on PTA is unfair is because we have always been dependent on PTA imports. And while we were dependent on PTA imports and the sector is very, very highly concentrated, an imposition of anti-dumping duty provided further protection to the sector. Now, the reason why this is significant, let me take you through a little bit more of these details and tell you about the significance of this. So if we look at the impact of the tariff alongside the anti-dumping duty on the PTA price that India faced vis-a-vis the rest of the world, particularly our competitors, let's say Vietnam. We also have to note that this period of 2014 to 20 saw a fairly steep decline in crude oil prices. Now, given the steep decline, it's very hard to figure out how much the anti-dumping duty and the tariff hike impacted domestic PTA prices. But if you look at the PTA price, the price of PTA, which was imported from South Korea over the same time period of 2014 to 20, and compare the change in price for Vietnam vis-a-vis India, we see that for Vietnam, the price for the imported PTA from Korea fell by 42%, whereas for India, it was only 26%. Now, this 16% gap is fairly large, especially when it happens at the top of the value chain. And this cascades down. As a result, for most of the period post 2014, capacity utilization of polyester producers has been extremely poor and has declined over previous levels. And this led to the falling productivity of the man-made textile sector compared to our competitors, which is Bangladesh and Vietnam, which over the same period have done phenomenally well, particularly Vietnam. Now, just to take you back a little bit and why the anti-dumping duty had certain distortionary effects on the man-made fiber, particularly polyester production in India. Now, if you look at the two companies who filed the anti-dumping duty on PTA, this is Reliance and Mitsubishi, and for the most part, Mitsubishi Chemicals didn't produce PTA over the last 1 decade. Now, Reliance being the dominant producer, accounting for over 60% of PTA production, also happens to be the world's largest integrated polyester producer. So what this means is that if you analyze Reliance Industries, its key intermediate input is not PTA, it is naphtha. And from naphtha, it refines paraxylene, and thereafter it refines it to purified terephthalic acid. Now, this increase in anti-dumping duty, the imposition of anti-dumping duties and this additional layer of protection through the tariff hike put Reliance Industries at a very uniquely advantageous position, because it produces its own PTA, which is employed in producing staple fiber, fiber fill, filament yarn, etc., which gave Reliance Industries a unique advantage in the sector, which other producers like Indorama or Bombay Dyeing didn't have. Now, as a result, if you look at the most recent statistics, Reliance is the largest polyester manufacturer in India. And it has the largest integrated polyester manufacturing facility in the entire world. Right? And over the last 1 decade, it's multiplied the number of plants it has, and it's also taken over 3 significantly large polyester producers, including Alok Industries. Right, so this growing concentration upstream of the polyester value chain has adversely affected productivity of the overall man-made textile sector. Now, the cascading effects can be seen by an overall decline in blended and non-cotton cloth production as a share of overall cloth production in India. And not just that, the decline in productivity also led to us losing share in the exports of man-made fiber-based cloth. Right? So while India was declining over the most of the last decade, particularly post 2015, 2014, Vietnam was slowly making its way up. Now, before we go down the value chain, to the very bottom of the value chain, that is the apparel sector. Now, one of the key things that one wonders is, well, PTA became expensive, which means that production of polyester staple fiber and yarn became probably more expensive in India, and India became relatively uncompetitive to the rest of the world, which could have had cascading effects on the weaving and the processing sector. The question is, why didn't the weaving and processing sector just import all the staple fiber and filament yarn that it needed for its activities? Now, the reason why that didn't work out very well for the weaving and the processing sector is because there was a tariff hike in 2018 from which pushed up the tariff on polyester fiber and filament yarn from 10% to 20%. And it remained at 20% till very recently. And this was reversed and brought down to 5% in May of 2022. But by then, the damage had already been done, and the effects downstream were quite significant. And interestingly, in 2022, once the anti-dumping duty on PTA was revoked, Reliance went ahead and filed an anti-dumping duty case for monoethylene glycol, which luckily and prudently was shot down by the government this year. Now, if you look at, if we skip the rest of the value chain and come straight down to the man-made fiber apparel manufacture, when we look at the value added per worker in a constant purchasing power parity sense, we see that India's GVA per worker for man-made apparel has mostly stagnated, and in the backdrop, Bangladesh, which is another country which has a cotton bias, has done significantly well compared to India. And if you look at the average real output per worker, and these numbers are from ASI, we see that post 2014, there has been a decline in the real output per worker for man-made apparel, which is not seen in cotton apparel production. Now, what is also very curious about this decline in productivity seen in man-made apparel is that apparel sector is that this decline has been concentrated in the most productive firms of the man-made apparel sector, whereas the most productive cotton apparel establishments did their productivity grew over the same period. Now, all of this led to us taking a hit in the global markets. And if you look at how Vietnam and Bangladesh have fared over the last 1 decade, we see that they've done significantly better to the extent that Bangladesh pipped India in man-made fiber apparel exports in roughly around 2017-18. And our global share of apparel exports has mostly stagnated over the last 2 decades. So concluding this discussion, we broadly find that the decline, one of the key factors explaining the decline of the clothing sector, that is textile and apparel, is related to the decline in the man-made fiber-based cloth as well as apparel production. Moreover, this poor performance of the sector can be explained, attributed to a unique policy mix of protectionism, which ended up favoring certain large producers in an already concentrated market, which had cascading effects downstream. And the apparel sector was a recipient of this disadvantage, with a decline in productivity and a resulting decline in global market share. So a couple of other things that we have to note is since we did most of the analysis, there have been some positive steps taken by the government. And one of these steps is, again, revoking the anti-dumping duty on PTA, reducing the tariff on PTA from 10% to 5%, and it still stands at 5%. In addition to that, the tariffs on all fiber intermediates, which including MEG and polyester, has been brought down to 5% uniformly. Now, this change in policy has probably been the result of a realization of the failure of this protectionist policy. And the verdict is still out there to see if this is adequate to undo the damage that was done over a good part of the last decade. And with that, I close the discussion and hand over the floor to the discussants.
Thank you, Naveen, for lucid presentation and sticking to time. I would call upon Professor M. Vijayabhaskar to give his comments, sir.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Naveen, so thank you for that very clear presentation. And yeah, both you and Abhishek for the very nice paper. Uh, the argument is very convincing, and it's worth kind of pushing further. So to begin with, a few minor points. Uh, it may be worth separating when you talk about global shares of China, India, and so on. It's always worth separating the textiles shares and the apparel shares, because clearly, as you know, just because you were for China, for example, what you find is textile share might be falling, but apparel shares are kind of increasing. Essentially means, they're kind of actually absorbing their raw material to to generate more value through making garments and exporting. So, it's always good to kind of keep that in mind. Similarly, when you talk about how India has lost out its share of in man-made textiles exports, see if it is worth removing exports to GCC countries, that is, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, because my sense is that quite a bit of man-made garments, man-made fiber-based garments are exported to Gulf countries to cater to the diasporic population, like in exports of saris and so on. So which might not really be competitive. Yeah, I might just want to, keep that in mind. So that's the other one. And third, I mean, when you talk about concentration of supplies, you talk about, Reliance being a major player and so on. So given the scale of raw material production, given the scale economies involved in man-made fiber production, that may well be the case in other countries like Taiwan, China, South Korea, which are all, Thailand, which are also major producers of man-made fibers and raw material. So my reading is that you may want to qualify it by saying it is not concentration per se, but the kind of practices that Reliance undertakes, which is the problem, not merely concentration. You might not just want to check that out, before going forward. Then one thing in terms of references, there is this recent 2021 study on man-made fibers, brought out by the Textiles Committee. It's a pretty lengthy document, which gives a breakup of how at each segment, where India stands, in terms of competitiveness and efficiency, vis-a-vis competing countries. So that might be useful for you to kind of, develop this paper further. Then finally, when you talk about decline in labor productivity or stagnation labor productivity, so it will be good to kind of map the potential pathways through which this happens. So one thing that is very clear is because of anti-dumping duties, there is less capacity utilization, which is adding up to the cost and so on. Is it just that, or is it something else? It might be worth, elucidating that a bit more clearer, because in the paper, it's not very clear, where that comes from. And also, when you talk about textiles and apparel together, see, when you look at the role of the sector in structural transformation, you talk about that in the paper. It's primarily, it's in the apparel segment, because that is where the labor intensity is pretty high, right? And if you look at the kind of role it has played in countries like Bangladesh or Vietnam, there they don't really have a very strong textile sector. It's more the apparel sector which has done well, which is where most of the jobs are. So, some amount of clarity on that will be useful, especially when you want to, stake a claim as to why, focus on the sector or a refocus on the sector, becomes important. You might want to kind of emphasize that. But having said that, I think you probably know this, but I think it's worth reiterating. So when the agreement on textiles and clothing expired in 2005, when multi-fiber agreement ceased to an end and the quota system was no longer prevalent, a lot of studies, kind of predictive studies, pointed out that while this post-agreement and textiles clothing face global trade, they're likely to be winners and losers. Invariably, everybody said India and China are going to be the biggest gainers. Okay, China and India are going to be the biggest gainers. But interestingly, as you point out, China proved the predictors right, while India did not. So one reason as to, when people talk about industry guys, what they normally say is that China anticipating in 2005, it's going to be a very competitive thing where, shares are not going to be driven by the quota system. They invested heavily in modern machinery, the upgraded factories, some small size factories, the expanded capacity to build several thousand machine factories and so on. Whereas in India, they strongly believe that there'll be enough market signals to induce investments by the private sector. Yeah, of course, we also had some financial incentives, but this is something which is worth kind of going back to, because you also do speak about financial incentives. You do talk about the production-linked incentives in the paper. What you find in the case of financial incentives in the sector is that it has not worked most of the time, except in the case of the Technology Upgradation Fund scheme. And even within the Technology Upgradation Fund scheme, you'd find only one phase where it was used very well by the textile spinning sector to upgrade its machinery and become competitive in the world market. So bulk of the improvement in cotton textile exports essentially came because of the Technology Upgradation Fund incentive. But a lot of other financial incentives have not worked. So, to what extent mere financial incentives or tax concessions may actually boost this industry? Yeah, this something we need to kind of take on board very strongly, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The other interesting thing is when you talk about friction, between raw material providers and users, it has also been true in the case of cotton. Yeah, you often find complaints or regular complaints by government associations, apparel manufacturers association, exporters association, saying that the cotton traders lobby essentially holds sway, vis-a-vis state policies. And they've been saying that, they shouldn't be allowed to export, especially when the domestic producers are in a crisis and so on. So this friction, which you highlight in the man-made sector, is something, close to what you find in the cotton segment also. Yeah, but somehow you find that in the case of cotton, of course, the industry has not kind of done exceedingly well, but compared to the man-made fiber segment, it has done well. So, so what is it about the man-made fiber segment which makes it even worse? Is worth talking about. Is it the kind of segments that they're specializing in? Is it the nature of competition? They're finding it hard to work against. So these are all issues, it's worth kind of talk about. Now, this financial incentives, one thing which policymakers, the industrial policy making literature suggests is that it may be useful to create production capacities. Yeah, but if the idea is to move away from just creating capacities to generating production capabilities, then financial incentives alone, may not kind of work. For example, we do know that in the case of textiles, the biggest source of growth and in fact innovation is in the fabric. Yeah, particularly in technical textiles, sports textiles. There's a huge amount of potential and and huge amounts of investments in R&D going into these sectors. But for that to happen, you need to have a few things in place. To begin with, it requires collaborative networks between material suppliers and users. Also, networks of collaboration between academic institutions, R&D centers, and again, producer and user segments. But here, you don't find in India, you don't find that happening. Instead, what, as your paper points out, there's a conflict of interest. Anti-dumping duties have been contested by user associations in the case of man-made fibers. And as I was telling you, as we discussed earlier, it is not just man-made fibers. Even in the case of cotton, you find a similar conflict of interest kind of happening. So again, can financial incentives again address it? My sense is we need to look beyond that and probably look for certain kind of structural factors, which are driving this process. I remember, when I was talking to somebody in one of the textile research association, one senior scientist, he mentioned that Reliance should ideally be doing the work that DuPont does, where DuPont invests heavily in innovations in the kind of fiber that they generate, the kind of fabric that they generate, and so on, which for various reasons Reliance is not able to do it. Instead, it sees it merely as a commodity and not as an input for value addition. So what kind of policy making, policy direction will change the incentive structure, which Reliance has, to make sure that it moves away from looking at PTA merely as a commodity over which it wants to make profits, but also as an input for value addition for the larger economy as a whole and employment generation. The second point is on this policy thing is the role of investments in public R&D. Again, as we know, the early stages of the textile industry, textile research associations. So you have the South Indian Textile Research Association, you have the Ahmedabad Textile Research Association. All of them contributed significantly to the productivity and also innovations in the industry. Yeah, but everything comes to some kind of a standstill by late 80s, early 90s. And at the moment, what you find is, one, the government is not investing enough. The number of scientists in all these institutions have declined dramatically. And even the kind of work that is kind of given to them in terms of contracts, what we are told is that very, very short-term kind of work. There's no investments in long-term R&D. So I'm not saying that the only way to do this is to revive these textile research associations, but it just goes to show that in the absence of such institutional linkages, mere financial incentives may not help us generate what we want to do, that is building up of production capabilities. Yeah. So the final point that I have on this is about the overall, how do we kind of interpret what you kind of point out in the case of man-made fibers. This recent paper by Viral Acharya, where he talks about how in recent times there has been a conscious shift in industrial policy towards creating so-called national champions through preferential allocation of projects. Yeah, and he points out that this has actually led to concentration of economic power among the so-called big five players, big business in India. The point is that while the national champions in strategy worked in a place like South Korea, because there was a distance between the state and big business, and also the state could ensure that the incentives for big business is very closely tied to the larger strategy of industrial development. But unfortunately, what we have here is a case where it seems the other way around. In some sense, the state policies seem to be responding to pressures from big business, which might not be a healthy thing. So it basically raises this question of relationship between, capital and the state, which is very, very vital for industrial policy. So I shall stop here and then probably, we can take it up later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Bhaskar. You want to respond now, or Naveen?
I think,
should we take the panelist view and then maybe you can respond?
Yeah, I think it's better to take all the panelists' view, and I'll take down questions, and then some of my responses I'll give at the end.
Okay. So, Dr. Bindu Oberoi, can I call you for sharing your comments, please?
Yeah. Just share my screen. So I would like to thank ISID for inviting me to this important seminar to discuss this important paper. And I prepared a short PPT to present my concerns on this paper. Is this visible? Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, fine. So here we go. See, we notice that the textile industry in India has experienced recession since the mid-60s to the 1980s, and the trend reversed itself since the early 90s. And during this period, the industry experienced substantial growth. This paper by Abhishek Anand and Naveen Joseph Thomas highlights that the performance of the sector has stagnated in recent years. The study shows that there is hardly any growth in the real output of the textile sector. Since 2011, it shows that the apparel sector has witnessed a significant slowdown during this period, and post 2014, the industry has been losing market share to global competitors. The study explains that the recent slowdown in the textile and apparel sector, largely in terms of decline in the production of man-made fibers, it explains how stagnation in the domestic production of PTA has resulted in a steady decline in the production of PSF in the post-2011 period. And this stagnation in the domestic production of PTA has resulted in increase in demand for the imported PTA. But then since, anti-dumping duties were imposed by the government in 2014, and then there was tariff hike in 2018, and this affected our imports of PTA adversely. So both stagnation in domestic production and decline in imports of PTA, they affected domestic availability of PTA. And the study shows that when crude oil prices declined during 2013, 2020, the fall in PTA prices in India was much weaker relative to the global prices. Thus, PTA remained relatively more expensive, and those producing the polyester fiber by procuring PTA from the open market became relatively uncompetitive. This affected capacity utilization in the production of PSF. And then the study shows that the firms engaged in the production of polyester staple fiber, they passed on the higher production costs to the final output, which resulted in higher prices of PCF. The study shows that this reduced productivity in the man-made textile sector, and the per worker output in the man-made textile sector in India declined, and it became even below that of Bangladesh and Vietnam during this period. The study shows that with the rising cost of production, declining productivity, and rising output prices, the man-made textile sector lost out on the external front. The study explains the decline in man-made fabric production and exports by India. The paper suggests that the sluggish performance of the man-made textile sector adversely affected the manufacturing of man-made apparel. The Indian apparel sector has been losing its productivity since 2016, when our competitors, such as Bangladesh, they continue to witness a surge in their productivity. With the loss of productivity and the decline in investments, especially in the most productive units, our man-made apparel producers have become relatively less competitive in the external market as well. Clearly, this paper has discussed several issues related to the growth of the textile sector. However, some issues have not been touched upon. For example, there is no discussion on the impact of tariff hike on PTA in the recent period on the protection which is given to the synthetic fiber industry. The protection which was given to this synthetic fiber industry declined considerably since the 1990s, when import duties declined on synthetic fibers as well as on the raw materials required in their production. the effective rate of protection for producing PSF using PTA and MEG, which was as high as 124% in 1994-95, declined to around 60 to 65% after the 1990s and was a mere 32% in 2005-6. After reading this paper, one is really curious to know how this effective rate of protection changed in the more recent period. Then again, the role of demand side factors, particularly the home demand, in what is the role of this internal demand, home demand, in slowing down the growth of textile industry has not been discussed in the paper. And I think this is important since the household sector is the largest buyer of textile products in India. There are other questions that remain unanswered. How did the rising prices of man-made textiles affect home demand for textiles? Was there a decline in domestic demand post 2011? If yes, then what was the source of this decline? Was this decline led by the top 20% of the population or by the middle income groups? Then again, are there any interfiber shifts in home demand for textiles? The revival of the industry since the 1990s saw a shift away from cotton towards non-cotton and blended textiles. One is curious to know to what extent this trend has got affected in the more recent period. Previous studies, they have identified rising incomes as an important factor that affects the growth of the textile and garment industry in India. And the revival of the industry since the 1990s, it was driven by rising incomes along with falling relative prices of textiles. One wonders what role was played by this factor, incomes, in explaining the stagnation of the textile sector in recent years. The study suggests that the problem emanating from PTA led to the declining performance of polyester fiber sector, which in turn resulted in declining performance of the man-made fabric and man-made apparel sector. While discussing the cascading of problems from man-made fiber to man-made apparel sector, the study analyzes the productivity of the apparel sector by looking at the gross value added per worker based on ASI factory level data. And this could be problematic. I just noticed when Naveen was presenting his paper that even the gross value added figures of textiles and clothing that show decline, they are also from ASI data, which covers only the factory level data. And this is not representative of the entire textile and clothing sector. The garment industry in India was reserved for the small scale sector, as he rightly mentioned, until 2005-6. And almost the entire garment sector, it continues to exist in the unregistered sector. So clearly, the results from ASI data may not be representative of the entire garment sector. It shows what is happening in the registered factory sector, but clearly cannot represent the entire textile and clothing sector. I think these are my concerns. This is all that I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bindu, for those comments.
Thank you, ma'am.
Reserve my responses to this towards the end.
So I call upon Dr. Sanjay Malik to give his comments.
Thank you, Rama. Yeah, I think that most of the comment, some of them I have thought about has already kind of, highlighted by Professor Vijay Bhaskar and Dr. Bindu Oberoi. Nevertheless, I have few things to say. I have a PPT. I'll share that. The discussion that I'm going to make, this is already presented. So I will briefly summarize. So The paper talks about there is stagnation in output of textile sector, and there is a significant slowdown in wearing apparel since 2011. And the slowdown in clothing is largely attributed to the slowdown in man-made clothing, that particularly polyester-based clothing. The production of polyester clothing during 2011-29 has affected by the production of PTA, which again affected by the imposition of anti-doping in 2014. Final paper talks about the government policy response and concludes it's inadequate to man-made clothing sector in India. I have a question on this. I have a serious problem with the central question of the paper, that is the stagnation of textile sector and particularly the slowdown of wearing apparel sector. I have taken the data from ASI, annual survey of industry, for the given period. I have seen is the following. See, you see, I have used ASI data. I have have that expressed that in 2011-12 price. You can see that there is no slowdown, no stagnation in textile sector. This is output. If you see the value added, again that is also showing that the value added of textile and apparel sector in 2011 price is also not declining. There is in value added also in 1920. There is still declining mode, but that is not included in the discussion of the paper. This is thing, and then further what I have done. So the central question of the paper, based on the stagnation of the textile sector, is problematic. So there is no stagnation. Author has used the UNIDO data. I don't understand why. Author has used ASI data for other part, or the central question, building the central question. The author has used the UNIDO data. I don't understand. He could have used the ASI data. ASI data, so anyone can do this exercise. I have done. So you can see that there is no stagnation in textile and apparel sector. That is NIC 2008. That is 13 and 14. I think the division is 13 and 14. When you can see that there is no stagnation. I have used this 2011-12 prices. I have to express the value in real constant price. See, again, I have kind of split the. I have considered only 2011, 12, 11 to 2019, not 11, 12. Their output of apparel sector, their expression 2011, 12 price. You see that is also not declining. And GV also not declining. There is no decline, no slowdown in the apparel sector on textile sector also. So the central question is very problematic. Author should not have relied upon the UNIDO data to analyze this. He should have instead focused on ASI data to start the discussion. Again, I have calculated the compound annual average growth rate. You see that textile and apparel sector during 1993 2020 it is 7.6. GVA is around 7%. So it is growing. It is not declining. Even if you restricted the period in 2011-22 to apparel sector only, output is declining and 4%, but value output is increasing at the rate of 4.26. Value added is around 7.5. So there is no decline, question of declining. But then I have a serious problem with the author has used two places. There is a complex level law that has created problem to the textile sector. I don't understand how come this complex level law, how he has defined, how it has made the textile sector problematic. I don't understand. If you see the labor productivity of this textile sector, it has been declining since the early, you can say the mid 90s. So, but author has not discussed what has happened prior to 2011. If you see that there is a textile crisis that we have prior to the economic reform, that is between 1956 to 1985. That was a period that was the crisis was not because of labor law. It is because of there is a government intervention. The 1956 industrial resolution, that what it did, it kind of froze the production capacity of the mill sector. They are organized mill where both spinning, weaving, and processing, finishing, everything was taken place. There was a restriction on the capacity of the production capacity of the organized mill sector. That limit was were effective till 1985. During the almost 3 decades, there was a restriction. And there is a 1964, There is another restricted regime, that is a control cloth regime, in which the mill sector, the organized mill, had to produce a stipulated quantity of fabrics at a very low rate. The two things, basically two interventions among others, are kind of led to the crisis in textile sector, and that labor has nothing to do. So during the 19, before 1985, whatever happened to the textile sector is not because of labor, it is because the problem of the government intervention. You can see the labor productivity, GBA per worker, has been increasing since 1995 onward. So, and again, but author has not discussed anything about that. The history has not been discussed very adequately. Very adequate manner, government has, the authors has discussed the history of the textile industry. Without knowing the history, how can you understand or the present situation? There is a serious problem. So authors should not should avoid using the complex labor law. Complex labor has nothing to do. It is a very, I don't understand. There is a big corporate house. They want to, use this flexible labor law so that they can hire and fire. That's why I don't know. Authors should be very careful using this kind of concept. Labor has nothing to do what has happened to the textile industry. Now it is doing well. Till date, it is doing well. Labor productivity is also increasing. I have some additional comment, but now focus on the man-made fiber-based sectors. And that author has discussed that there is a decline in clothing sector due to man-made fiber-based sector. It is not true. There is no decline in clothing sector, so you cannot attribute to this man-made fiber. There is, of course, there is a decline in man-made fiber-based sector, but nevertheless, I have something more to say. See, but the author has discussed the share of the man-made fiber-based yarn and fabrics in the textile industry. That need to be established. What is the share of man-made fiber or man-made fiber-based on in the textile industry? To establish, we should see what are the share that need to be first know before we explaining the man-made fiber. Man-made fiber is very important. There's nobody discussing, nobody denying that we need to focus on that. Authors would have started from the man-made fiber itself rather than kind of centering through textile. That has been a problematic. So you see the natural man-made fiber has almost on an average. I have used the Ministry of Textile data. So 1915-16 to 21-22, you see that on an average there are around 20%. Natural fiber-based one, they have significant share. There's something around 80 to 85% share during this period, during which author has placed his study. So natural fiber, that includes cotton-based fabric also, cotton-based yarn also. So man-made fiber is there, but it has a very around less than quarter share in textile industry. This is the yarn only, total yarn. But I am not. I didn't get time to see the fabrics. What has happened to man-made fiber-based fabrics? That you need to see also. What is their share in the total apparel sector? And there is some additional comment also I have. The PTA, there is a key intermediate input to man-made fiber industry that got stagnated after 2010. That means that PTA has been doing better before 2011. So we need to analyze what has happened to this PTA production of this intermediate input before 2011. That we need to know. They have been doing well. All of a sudden they decline. So that without knowing that, if you need to know the history of what they have been doing, how they have performed. First, we need to know that. Without knowing them, we cannot simply, you have the problem I found in this paper is the restricted period. Only consider 2011 to 2029. Author have, focused the discussion during this period, but the analysis should be expanded from early 90s onward. Then you would have got a more clear picture. Then explain the problem of the PTA production. So again, also the PTA, the PTA that got stagnated after 2010. Okay, but anti-dumping came into in 2014. So we can clearly say that PTA, the production of PTA is affected only because of dumping. There are other factors also into play. They also contributed to the stagnation of PTA. Okay, that you need to think. That you can have a clear idea if you explain what has happened before that. What has happened to the PTA, during 90s during 2000, what has happened to that? If you understand the process of production in PTO during that period, then you can clearly understand, very clearly you can understand what has happened to this to PTO during the 2011 to 2019. So I have already emphasized the author has discussed what has happened to the textile industry during the 1956 to 85, and also he has not discussed what has happened to textile industry. Very clearly you need to explain. You should give the data. You have to give the fact. That is the fact is available around. We have data. Why? What is the problem in showing this data? You see the data. What is the distribution of man-made fiber, share of man-made fiber in all the textile segment? That we need to know. And there is another problem with the there is a figure in figure 7. The production share of man-made fiber has started declining since 2004, but the author has focused from 2011. That is also share has declined, not value. Share has declined. So we should also focus from 2004 onward. And there is a that's I think the problem, there is a serious problem with the author has focus about centering the man-made fiber. There is a more man-made fiber should be discussed from with a long time period analysis, long-term analysis should be there. At least what has happened to the man-made fiber during the last 3 decades. Once you analyze, you should analyze the man-made fiber sector in a historical perspective. Then only you will have a clear idea what has happened prior to 2011, what has happened now. If you do not know what has happened to multi-matter fiber, what are the factors they contribute to the success of man-made fiber. If you cannot understand the success, how can you understand the failure? Now you are focusing on the failure of the man-made fiber. So you should also understand the man-made fiber process of production of man-made fiber during before 2011. Then you will have your paper can improve. But I would suggest that focus on the paper only on man-made fiber. Don't bring the textile industry as well. You can focus there. There are man-made fiber has around 20% or 25%, whatever. You establish that. From there you focus. Don't go into the textile industry. So that is then you are putting yourself into trouble. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay, for very focused points of suggestion. So I call upon Naveen, and maybe you can take 3 to 4 minutes to respond before we open the floor. You're on mute.
I'll respond very quickly to the comments made by Professor Vijay Bhaskaran. I think one of the comments was that we haven't separated the textile and apparel sectors. We actually have segregated and analyzed those sectors separately. And what we've tried to do is try to move down the value chain and look at how certain issues in the initial bits of the value chain have cascaded down. And we've tried to keep that distinction quite consistent throughout the paper. And thank you for suggesting those recent studies. We'll definitely look at them. And I think there's this one bit that I want to discuss, which is on financial incentives like PLI. I think that's a very interesting question that you pose, because post 2018, what the government has done is a dual policy of raising tariffs in general. And 2018, there was a fairly stiff hike in tariffs. For example, if you look at most of man-made apparel intermediates, be it polyester staple fiber, or for that matter, filament yarn, the duties were almost doubled in 2018. And for key intermediates like MEG and PTA, they were raised to 10%. There was a minor increase of 2.5%. And then you bring in the PLI somewhere in 2021. Now, this might have worked quite well for sectors like, let's say, infant industry. This can be thought of as some infant industry protection, and could have worked for the toy sector, or for that matter, mobile phone manufacturing. But the question at large is, what was the objective in introducing this for the clothing sector, the textile and apparel sector to be specific? So you did increase all the tariffs in 2018, and in 21, you suddenly withdraw everything and bring all of these tariff levels to 5%, and you maintain the PLI scheme. So it's sort of curious to see what exactly was happening there. And I think the simple answer to that is, given the concentration in the sector, it was very evident that the largely fragmented middle bit of the value chain, that is the weaving and processing sector, which is mostly decentralized and extremely fragmented, suffered quite drastically. And there were some cascading effects on the apparel sector, which led to broad loss in productivity and international competitiveness. So I think that's something that's very curious about the way in which this policy mix broadly failed and was eventually withdrawn last year for a most part. And the government is quite clear on what it wants to do. It intends to provide the PLI for man-made fiber, but it wants to keep duties low, because any hike in duty adversely affects this middle sector, which is large and fragmented. Coming to the comments by Professor Oberoi, I completely agree that the consumption data must be analyzed, but our broader objective was to try and figure out how India has fared in terms of its global competitiveness. That's why we restricted ourselves from analyzing the consumption data. I'm aware that this consumption data is available from various volumes of the the Office of the Textile Commissioner, but we take that point is well taken, and we'll analyze that more carefully. Now, coming to our restricted analysis to just the registered manufacturing sector. Now, what's important to note there is post 2001, it's a good 2 decades after the revoking of the small scale industries reservation, and from the perspective of the export markets, I don't think this disaggregated sector has any role to play. If at all, it has a role to play in terms of subcontracting to the registered manufacturing sector, which by analyzing just the registered manufacturing sector, you can broadly capture. But if you're talking about productivity, there is no chance that we can get a different picture by looking at the productivity of the unorganized manufacturing sector, which is most likely going to be far lower productive than any operation in the registered sector. So I'm not sure that is going to add any value to our study. Now, coming to our third review, I wish you had read our paper a little bit more carefully. We have used UNIDO data, but if you would know, the UNIDO data is entirely based on the ASI data. And the decline that we are talking about, it's not an absolute decline, it's a relative decline that is fairly concerning, precisely when we are talking about increasing GVA of the manufacturing sector, and that to a sector which employs a fair number of the manufacturing sector workers. Now, we have used the ASI. I'm not sure why that comment was put in. We've used ASI extensively in the study, and most of the GVA numbers are from the ASI and not from UNIDO. There are places where we used UNIDO just for comparison with the rest of the other countries. But when we are commenting only on India, we've been restricting ourselves to the ASI data. And I'm not sure. Okay, so right. So there were some valid points that were raised on what happened. So we've been seeing a decline in capacity utilization post 2010, and what new did the anti-dumping duty do? Now, the capacity utilization has to be a capacity utilization of PTA production has to be looked in tandem with the import of PTA. Indeed, capacity utilization has been declining post 2010, but at that same time, import of PTA was quite high as well. But what happened post 2014 and the introduction of the anti-dumping duty, followed by the introduction of a tariff hike, was that imports became significantly more expensive. So you have sort of a restricting of a supply of PTA to anybody who was procuring PTA from the open markets, and which was exactly the hue and cry created by Indorama and all the other major non-integrated man-made fiber, polyester fiber producers. And having said that, this paper was definitely about the man-made fiber segment. And I think there was at some point you looked at the apparel sector. If you read the paper carefully, we have segregated output of the apparel sector in terms of cotton and man-made. If you look at numbers from overall apparel sector, you will see that the decline is not too bad. What we've done is we've classified firms as man-made apparel producers as well as cotton apparel producers by looking at the broad input mix used by these firms, and that comes from a very careful analysis of the NCMS input codes for the inputs used. So although you don't see any significant decline in overall output or output per worker in overall apparel manufacturing in India, that's precisely what we see. If you look at cotton, which is dominant, you don't see much change there. You don't see anything very odd going on if you look at the sector in aggregate. But I think that the decline is very specific when you do this very nuanced, careful analysis of segregating both these apparel sector, which is not trivial. Okay, so and over the.
Yeah, thank you, Naveen, for your response. This is a work in progress, I think, and we keep improving upon whatever we have done so far. I would now open the forum for any queries and suggestions, but please keep it very brief because we are only having a few minutes for open discussion. But before that, Dr. Beena from ISID, she has put in a comment, so you can read it for your own information. And I would open up the forum for any questions from the audience. Please raise your hands and kindly then speak up.
Rama, can I respond to Professor Beena's question?
Yeah, please do. Please.
Okay. So I completely agree that concentration should be calculated at the firm level rather than the plant level. But we can always take the concentration indices generated for plant level as the lower bound because it's not going to be any lower. So if we say that concentration has been rising at the plant level, it'll be rising much steeper at the firm level. So we take this as a lower bound, given the lack of appropriate adequate data. So I've also looked at the prowess data very carefully, the product level prowess data, which provides firm level data rather than plant level data. But the only problem there is the inconsistency in the way production data is reported. For example, we'll find production data for Reliance, which is one of the largest producers. but you won't find production data for, let's say, Bombay dyeing, which is another important producer. You'll find sales data for that. So I don't get a consistent single variable of either production or sales on which I can base my my concentration numbers. But given whatever numbers I have, assuming taking the argument that, well, if you account for Reliance and Indorama, the share of the other producers is extremely small. Even then, if I calculate this incomplete firm level Herfindahl index, it's almost twice this number, and that too has been increasing over time. But I'm far less confident about the numbers that are generated by that I can generate from prowess at the firm level, because several of the key players, I don't have that one single variable where every key player has reported data on. So that is the broad restriction that I face. But otherwise, your point is taken, and that's why we've stuck to ASI. Whatever it is, it's the set of companies that have been producing man-made fibers. And that is also not trivial on how to calculate, because just producing man-made fiber would give you a lot of very large recycled man-made fiber producers, which cater to a very different segment. So we have to match that with raw materials that I use. That is exactly PTA and MEG. In fact, that also creates other problems, because some producers would be using naphtha instead of PTA as an intermediate input. So a very careful analysis is done, and this is done for the period starting from 2005. And what we find is that the set of firms are somewhat stable. A set of, not firms, plants are somewhat stable in ASI from 2014-15 onwards up to 2019-20. Any new plant introduced has only been introduced by Reliance. We can track that easily. There's one that shows up in 2016 in Silvassa, and that the only plant that was opened in Daman and Diu was by Reliance. So it's easy and consistent and same set of firms. But yes, that is definitely the lower bound, and it's not the exact concentration. The actual concentration is much higher.
Thank you, Naveen. Any other in the participants who would like to ask or make suggestions? If not, I would like to wrap up this session. And thank you, Naveen, Abhishek, for this sharing this paper and the findings. And thank you, the panelists, for giving a lot of healthy suggestions and making this a very insightful and useful interaction on this very important sector, which is the a very important part of Indian economy. So I thank you all for joining us, the participants also. Thank you for being part of this discussion. And this series keeps on going for further papers and further studies by very, very young researchers like Naveen and Abhishek. So we look forward to more interactions with you, and thank you all for joining us. Goodbye and good evening.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. Thank you.
Thank you.
For the valuable suggestions. Thank you so much.